Hi, I'm Rachel, here with my cat Leia, and I'm here to review Nine Folds Make a Paper Swan by Ruth Gilligan. I'm reviewing this book twice. I already reviewed it on Goodreads in written form, and now I'm reviewing it in video form, more specifically for Anna and Eric's book club. They're going to hopefully get their own video up soon, but in the meantime, I'll also link to my written review down below. Nine Folds Make a Paper Swan is a novel told in 3 parts from 3 time periods about 3 narrators involved with the Irish Jewish community. We start with Ruth, who in 1901 is a young child fleeing from the Eastern European pogroms, and she accidentally lands with her family in Cork rather than New York. And then we follow her for 40 years. Then there's Shem, a mute boy whom we follow for 4 months, right after he's placed in a mental institution for not speaking because he has this big secret. And within that time he meets his roommate Alf, who connects him to Ruth's story. And finally, for 4 days in 2013, we follow Aisling, an Irish Catholic who is debating conversion because of the ultimatum given by her British Jewish boyfriend, and she's ultimately connected to Shem's story. My feelings about this book are a little ambivalent. On the one hand, I like how Ruth Gilligan chose not to dictate the story of the Irish Jews in a chronological manner. She sort of explained this decision in an interview that she gave on the Unorthodox podcast, that she was more interested in the stories of the Irish Jewish community than their actual history. On the other hand, I had some problems, particularly with Ruth and Aisling's stories. We jump 10 years between chapters in Ruth's sections, and despite the fact that part of that I think has to do with the fact that her life doesn't actually change much in those 10 years, I still find it very jarring. It's kind of like her story is too little butter spread over too much bread. As for Aisling, I don't think her narrative arc fit the theme of the novel enough. Her boyfriend wasn't even an Irish Jew, but an English one. Ultimately, we needed her for plot purposes, but otherwise I found her presence to be a little disconcerting. Gilligan focuses a lot of her story on Jewish folklore and Irish folklore, and the Jewish quest for an independent homeland and the Irish quest for an independent homeland, and I'm sure that could be alienating to some readers. Speaking as someone who's relatively familiar with Ashkenazi Jewish history, but not so much with Ireland's, I could feel a little lost sometimes. But then that begs the question, is it the novelist's place to explain all the references? Or should I just go ahead and pick up a history book? I do love this one particular passage in here that plays with Yiddish and Irish phonology. It's also a little bittersweet for the character involved, who desperately wants to combine his Jewish identity and his growing sense of Irish identity, but the natives of Ireland aren't quite so keen on that. With my apologies for pronunciation of Irish and Yiddish words coming up. Well, it was me and Moshe who went to the housing office when we first arrived. But on our way back on the tram, a lad takes one look at our garb and asks, "Where are ye boys from?" And Moshe replies, "Cahob shoin farksen." That is, for those of you who don't speak Yiddish, I have forgotten. Because I think his head is in a right spin at this point, trying to take it all in. But then the lad replies, "Well, Sean Ferguson, pleasure to meet you, boy, and welcome to Cork." Shook his hand and everything. And so I called him Sean from that day forward, his Irish alter ego. This dichotomy of Jewish versus Irish also exists between Ruth's family members, with her and her father wanting to embrace a Jewish diaspora in Ireland, and her mother and sister wanting to look elsewhere for a homeland. One enduring part of Ruth's story is how when she leaves Lithuania to come to ultimately Ireland, she's allowed to take one possession, and she takes a compass, and as they're moving on the ship and then later throughout her life, she repeats the mantra of north, south, east, and west, and that's ultimately what happens to her family. They move in different directions. For east and west, it's more of a literal movement, and then I have my own pretentious ideas about who moves north and south in a more metaphorical way. Along that vein, I guess it's interesting to note that for Ashkenazi Jews, at least of the early 20th century, it seems that Ireland would probably be as unknown to them as Jews were as a group to Irish. And Gilligan confirmed in her interview that the Jewish community in Ireland is dwindling, and certainly a bunch of her characters within the story are constantly thinking of leaving. So in a way, it's like this book is a swan song to that community. And from there we get to the title of this book, which alludes to origami swans and also real swans. Gilligan weaves this tapestry throughout the book to showcase the characters' struggles with identity. Sometimes the paper meant fragility, like Aisling thinking of riding on a paper plane to her home in Ireland when she's debating her conversion. Other times there are allusions to characters folding themselves into origami shapes. That's usually to fit into what they think people expect from them, or sometimes what their own choices have forced them into. And then when identity was strong, the real swan would emerge. This is most bittersweet and most poignant in one of Ruth's final sections, where she imagines a story of digging and unearthing a swan who comes back to life and flies away. And I think this talks about her own sense of submerged identity and how much she really wants to fly free as a fully realized person. Overall, there's a lot of bittersweet in this novel about dreams unlived and lives unread. But the caveat is that they live on through stories told about them but by other people. And that to me feels like maybe the most Jewish thing ever to live on in the written word. On a final set of notes about Shem, first I really appreciate Gilligan's choice to break from third-person narration with him. He's a mute throughout his entire story, so the first-person narration is really the only way that we can get a sense of his voice. But on the other hand, perhaps that made things a little too easy. He himself was a bit of a simpleton, and his parents were kind of one-dimensionally good or bad, and his entire religious education boiled down to ridiculous platitudes. But ultimately, that might be me being subjective about the whole thing. I think there's a real power in his story and in Ruth's story about how they struggle within the confines of their lives. I think I've said about everything I want to cover, and as you might be able to see, my companion might be about to leave me soon. She's left her usual perch. But I'd love to hear what other readers of this novel have to say, and I'm eagerly awaiting Eric and Anna's video, assuming that it will be a video. But for now, thanks so much for watching my review. Happy reading. I'll see you next time.